Welcome to the Indian Chronicles, the podcast where we dive deep into the lives of history's most extraordinary figures. Today, we are undertaking a monumental journey. We are tracing the life of a woman who was, in every sense, a century ahead of her time. A Sanskrit scholar who became a social pariah, a Hindu widow who converted to Christianity only to defy the church itself, a penniless orphan who circled the globe and raised a fortune, a feminist visionary who built a kingdom for women in the heart of patriarchal India. Her name was Pandita Ramabai Sarasvati. Her story is not just a biography. It's an epic narrative that stretches from the forest ashrams of India to the bustling cities of Victorian England and America, and back again. It's a story of relentless quest for knowledge, for faith, for freedom, and for a place to belong. Over the next while, we will unravel this incredible life, relying on meticulous research from biographies, her own writings, and scholarly analyses. So, settle in. This is the story of Pandita Ramabai. Chapter 1. The Unconventional Seed, A Childhood on the Road. Our story begins not with Ramabai's birth in 1858, but with her father, Anant Shastri Dongre. To understand the daughter, we must first understand the father. He was a Chitpavan Brahmin, a renowned Sanskrit scholar, but also a radical. In an era when teaching Sanskrit to women and Shudras was considered a sin that would condemn you to hell, Anant Shastri did the unthinkable. He taught his wife, Lakshmi Bai. His inspiration, as some accounts suggest, came from the learned wife of the Peshwa Baji Rao II. He argued, defiantly, that there was no real injunction in the sacred texts that prohibited women from learning. For this heresy, his community ostracized him. Faced with social exile, he made a dramatic choice. He retreated with his family into the forest, living in an ashram, dedicating himself fully to his wife's education. This was the world Ramabai was born into in 1858. A world on the margins, a world of intellectual defiance. The family's isolation was both spiritual and practical. They were poor. To survive, Anant Shastri eventually turned his profound knowledge into a profession. The family became Pauranikas, itinerant reciters of the Puranas. When Ramabai was just 6 months old, the family left their forest home and began a perpetual pilgrimage, crisscrossing the length and breadth of the Indian subcontinent. Imagine that childhood. No fixed home, no community, just constant movement from one holy site to another, from the temples of South India to the Ghats of Varanasi. This life of travel was Ramabai's first and most formative education. It stripped her of any narrow, parochial identity. She was not a Maharashtrian or a Kannadiga. She was, first and foremost, a citizen of India. Her academic education was equally extraordinary. Taught primarily by her mother, who had been taught by her father, Ramabai mastered Sanskrit grammar, memorized thousands of verses from the Puranas, like the Bhagavata Purana, and delved into complex texts. Yet, as she later recalled, it was strictly religious. Secular education was looked upon with disdain. Learning any language other than Sanskrit was out of the question. She was being groomed as a guardian of orthodox tradition, even as she lived a life utterly unconventional for a Brahmin girl. But tragedy, as it so often does, struck with brutal force. In the 1870s, a devastating famine swept through central India. The family, already living on the edge of poverty, was utterly vulnerable. One by one, Ramabai watched her family starve to death. First her elder sister, then her father, and finally her mother. By the age of 16, she was an orphan, alone in the world with only her older brother, Srinivas. The horror of this period is hard to overstate. After her father died, having recently taken sannyas, his body needed to be buried, not cremated. There was no one to perform the rites. The two teenagers, Srinivas and Ramabai, wrapped their father's body in a dhoti. Srinivas hauled it onto his back, walked 2 miles, and with the help of a kind-hearted Brahmin, finally gave him a burial. When their mother died, the scene was even more desperate. 2 wayfarers took pity on them and helped carry the body. Srinivas and the young Ramabai herself shouldered the bier. They carried their mother's body for 3 miles before they could find a place to cremate her. This was a profound violation of custom. Hindu women simply did not participate in funeral processions. But for Ramabai, circumstance had already forced her to set aside the obstacles of custom from a terrifyingly young age. The seeds of disillusionment with a faith that offered no solace in such immense suffering were sown deep in this fertile ground of trauma. She and Srinivas continued their nomadic life, now alone. They survived by giving religious discourses at temples, but their faith was crumbling. As Ramabai later wrote in her autobiographical work, a testimony, "We had fulfilled all the conditions laid down in the sacred books and kept all the rules as far as our knowledge went. But the gods were not pleased with us and did not appear to us. After years of fruitless service, we began to lose our faith in them and in the books which prescribed this course." The intellectual and spiritual journey of Pandita Ramabai had begun. She was searching, though she did not yet know what for. Chapter 2. Calcutta, Critique, and a Clash of Worlds. The siblings' wanderings eventually led them to Calcutta in 1878. The heart of the British Raj and the epicenter of the Bengali Renaissance was about to meet a most unusual pair. When the city's intellectual elite heard of a young Brahmin woman who possessed stunning erudition in Sanskrit, a language from which she was supposed to be barred, they were astonished. A public examination was arranged in the Senate Hall of the university. A panel of the most eminent Sanskrit scholars of Calcutta grilled her. She passed with flying colors. They were so impressed that they bestowed upon her the highest titles of honor, Pandita, scholar, and Sarasvati, goddess of learning. She was now Pandita Ramabai Sarasvati. In Calcutta, she was a sensation. The progressive Bengalis saw in her a living embodiment of their idealized ancient Indian womanhood, a Vedic-era scholar like Gargi or Maitreyi reborn. She was proof that India had a golden past for women that could be resurrected. It was here that her horizons expanded beyond the Puranas. She began to read the Vedic literature and the Dharma Shastras, the law books that had been forbidden to her. What she found appalled her. She was puzzled by the sheer variety of opinions, but she identified a common grim thread, the systematic degradation of women and the denial of their access to moksha, spiritual liberation. She later wrote in The High Caste Hindu Woman, Host, reading with measured gravity, I can say honestly and truthfully that I have never read any sacred book in Sanskrit literature without meeting this kind of hateful sentiment about women. She cited verses that called women as impure as falsehood itself and warned that she is never to be trusted. This intellectual awakening coincided with her introduction to the Brahmo Samaj, the influential reformist movement founded by Raja Rammohan Roy. She was drawn to its monotheism and its advocacy for women's education. She started giving lectures, comparing the exalted, though perhaps mythical, status of women in the ancient past with their deplorable condition in the present. But the Brahmo Samaj ultimately disappointed her. She found it too vague, too much of a personal, pick-and-choose faith. She called it a religion that has no other foundation than man's own natural light. It could not satisfy her deep yearning for a definitive spiritual answer. Then, another devastating personal blow landed. In 1880, her brother and lifelong travel companion, Srinivas, died of cholera. Ramabai was now completely alone in the world, anchorless and adrift. In this state of grief and isolation, she made another defiant choice. She married her brother's friend, Bipin Behari Das Medvi, a Bengali lawyer. He was a progressive man, but crucially he was a Shudra. For a Chitpavan Brahmin woman to marry outside her caste was social suicide. It was a decisive step away from the orthodox Hinduism that had already rejected her family. The marriage, though short-lived, was a happy one. They moved to Assam, and in 1881 Ramabai gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Manorama, meaning heart's joy. It seemed her restless life had finally found a safe harbor. Her husband was aware of her growing spiritual inquiries and her discussions with a Christian missionary who visited them, but he did not encourage her to convert. The harbor was not to last. Barely a year and a half into the marriage, Bipin Behari died suddenly. leaving Ramabai a widow at the age of 23 with an infant daughter. In 19th century India, there was arguably no worse fate for an upper caste woman than widowhood. Ramabai herself would later describe it as the worst and most dreaded period of a high caste woman's life, seen as a punishment for sins in a former life. Widows were shunned, their heads shaved, forced to wear white, and subjected to severe dietary and social restrictions. Now Ramabai was living that reality, but she was not a woman to be broken. With little Manorama in her arms, she decided to return to her ancestral homeland, Maharashtra, a place she barely knew. She was headed for Pune, the intellectual heartland of Western India. Chapter 3. The Reformer from the Outside. Pune and the Arya Mahila Samaj Ramabai arrived in Pune in 1882. The city was in the throes of the social reform debate, led by towering figures like Justice Mahadev Govind Ranade and Dr. R.G. Bhandarkar of the Pradhana Samaj. Gender was a central question, but it was a debate largely conducted by men about women who were treated as objects of reform rather than active subjects. Into this male-dominated arena walked Pandita Ramabai, a young, widowed, incredibly learned woman who had already lived a life none of them could imagine. She was immediately both a fascination and an asset to the reformers. With their support, she did something revolutionary. On July 1, 1882, she founded the Arya Mahila Samaj, Aryan Women's Society. It was one of the first organizations in India dedicated to the cause of women by a woman. Its objectives were radical: to promote women's education, abolish child marriage, and end the practice of polygamy. Her methods were ingenious. To ensure women could attend her lectures, she made a simple but powerful rule: any man who wished to attend must be accompanied by at least one woman from his household. It was a tactical masterstroke that forced families to bring their secluded women into the public sphere. Her fame and credibility were such that she was invited to testify before the Hunter Commission, a government body formed to look into the state of education in India. In September 1882, her testimony was a landmark moment in the history of Indian feminism. She didn't just ask for education, she demanded a systematic infrastructure for it. She argued for the training of women teachers, and most importantly, for women doctors. She pointed out the cruel catch-22. Women were dying because they were too modest to be treated by male doctors, but they were denied the education to become doctors themselves. Her plea was so powerful that her Marathi testimony was translated into English and circulated widely, leading to the formation of an association for female medical aid in India. During this period, she also wrote her first major book, Stri Dharma Niti, Morals for Women, in Marathi. The book was a bestseller, but it also drew fierce criticism from orthodox circles. It emphasized the idea of self-cultivation for women as individuals, beyond their roles as wives and mothers. The income from this book was crucial. It gave her the financial independence to plan her next, even more audacious move. She had decided to become a doctor. She believed that medicine was the surest way to achieve both economic self-reliance and the ability to serve her countrywomen. To do this, she would need to go to England to study medicine. The Anglican Sisters of the Community of St. Mary the Virgin, CSMV, in Pune, impressed by her, offered to arrange her stay at their mother house in Wantage, England. Before leaving, she made a public declaration. She was going to England for medical studies, and she was resolved not to change her religion. In April 1883, Pandita Ramabai and her 2-year-old daughter Manorama boarded a ship to England. She was leaving India as a Hindu reformer. She would return transformed. Chapter 4. The English Crucible, Conversion and Conflict. The voyage to England was itself traumatic. Her dear friend and travelling companion Anandibai Bhagat, who had converted to Christianity and considered herself Ramabai's adopted daughter, suddenly committed suicide on the ship. It was a shocking start to her new life. Upon arrival in England, her carefully laid plans immediately unravelled. The doctors at the Wantage Sisterhood examined her and delivered a devastating verdict. Due to a significant hearing impairment, she would be unable to study medicine. The primary purpose of her journey was gone. This professional setback, combined with the profound loneliness and cultural alienation of being an Indian woman in cold Victorian England, pushed her into a deep depression. The Sisters of Wantage became her surrogate family. She was deeply moved by their compassionate work, particularly their efforts to help fallen women. She later wrote in her testimony, "Here, for the first time in my life, I came to know that something should be done to reclaim the so-called fallen women, and that Christians, whom Hindus considered outcasts and cruel, were kind to these unfortunate women." Her spiritual quest, which had been simmering for years, now reached a boiling point. She began reading the Bible with new eyes. The figure of Christ, who offered salvation and unconditional love to all, regardless of gender or caste, stood in stark contrast to the deities she felt had abandoned her during the famine. In September 1883, just a few months after arriving in England, Pandita Ramabai was baptized into the Anglican Church. Her daughter Manorama was also baptized. She was given the Christian name Mary Rama. News of her conversion sent shockwaves through India. The reformers in Pune felt betrayed. The Orthodox felt vindicated in their suspicion of her. They accused her of converting for monetary gain. For Ramabai, however, it was a moment of intellectual and spiritual conviction, a natural outcome of her long search. But her relationship with Christianity was complex from the very beginning. She had not exchanged one set of dogmas for another. Almost immediately, she found herself in serious conflict with her spiritual mentor, Sister Geraldine, and the Anglican establishment. Several points of friction emerged. 1. Patriarchy and hierarchy. Ramabai was shocked to discover that the Anglican Church was as hierarchical and patriarchal as the Brahmanical structures she had left. She chafed against the demand for absolute obedience to church authority. 2. Nationalism. A fierce Indian nationalist, she was deeply uncomfortable with the title Church of England. As one Anglican letter noted, had it been the Church of Christ in England, things might have been different. Aligning with the religion of the colonizers felt like a betrayal of her nation. 3. Theology and dogma. Her rational, questioning mind rejected doctrines she could not find explicitly stated in the Bible. She particularly struggled with the concept of the Holy Trinity, finding it uncomfortably close to the Hindu polytheism she had rejected. She showed interest in more Unitarian ideas, which the Church deemed heretical. The epistolary exchange between Ramabai and Sister Geraldine is a fascinating record of this clash. In one letter, Ramabai asserts her independence with stunning clarity. "It seems to me that you are advising me under the WE to accept always the will of those who have authority, etc. This, however, I cannot accept. I have a conscience and a mind and a judgment of my own. I must myself think and do everything which God has given me the power of doing." The Church saw her as a prized convert, a Brahmin wedge they could use to evangelize Hindu society. They wanted to control her. But Ramabai refused to be a pawn. She continued to wear the simple white sari of a Hindu widow, maintained a vegetarian diet, and followed caste restrictions, confusing and angering the sisters. Her mentality, as scholar Meera Kosambi notes, was still that of a Hindu Brahmin lady. The relationship became so strained that she moved to Cheltenham in 1884 to teach Sanskrit at the Cheltenham Ladies' College. Here, another conflict erupted. The bishops of Lahore and Bombay were scandalized that a woman, a native woman at that, was teaching young English men. Ramabai was furious at this racist and patriarchal injunction. She saw it as an injustice to her principles and her capabilities. It was clear that her conversion was not leading to the freedom and peace she had sought. She had exchanged the hierarchies of Hinduism for the hierarchies of the Church. She was trapped between two worlds, accepted by neither. She needed a way out. Chapter 5. The American Sojourn, Freedom, Funds, and a Feminist Manifesto. The way out came in 1886. Ramabai was invited to the United States to attend the graduation of her cousin, Anandibai Joshi, from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. Anandibai was making history as the first Indian woman to become a doctor trained in Western medicine. For Ramabai, this was a perfect opportunity. In February 1886, she and Manorama set sail for America, leaving the stifling confines of Anglican England behind. America was a revelation. As she describes in her Marathi travelogue, United Statistki Lokastiti Ani Pravasvrita, the peoples of the United States, she found a society that was, in her eyes, far more egalitarian and free, especially for women. She was enthralled by the sight of women participating freely in public life, working, studying, and engaging in civic discourse. Her description of the storm she endured on the Atlantic crossing serves as a powerful metaphor for her own life. In the first chapter of her travelogue, she writes, "The storm caused us a great deal of hardship. For 3 to 4 days, we could not even lift up our heads. The air in our cabin became too stale to breathe, so I resolved to go up on the deck and left the cabin, gathering all my courage. Within a quarter of an hour, it was as if the fresh ocean air infused a new life force into my body. Now I felt not an iota of fear. On the contrary, my heart surged with energy, joy, and peace. I shall never forget the lesson I learned. Man dreads adversity and enemies as long as he refrains from confronting them bravely." America was her fresh ocean air. She was, as one scholar put it, on fire. For the next 2.5 years, she was a whirlwind of activity. She undertook a punishing lecture tour, speaking to church groups, women's clubs, and reform associations like the Christian Temperance Union and the Suffragettes. Her purpose was clear: to educate Americans about the plight of high-caste Hindu women and to raise funds for a residential school for widows in India. And she was spectacularly successful. During this time, she wrote and published her seminal work, The High-Caste Hindu Woman. It was a devastating critique. With the precision of a scholar, she used the Hindu Shastras themselves, particularly the laws of Manu, to expose the architectural oppression of women, the logic of child marriage, the horrors of widowhood, the denial of education. It was, as the dean of her cousin's college called it, the book that broke the silence of 1,000 years. The book became an international bestseller, selling 10,000 copies within a year. Between the book's profits and her lecture fees, she raised over $30,000, a colossal sum equivalent to millions today, for her cause. She founded the Ramabai Association in Boston to manage the funds and support her project for 10 years. It was a staggering achievement, almost unbelievable for an Indian woman, a lone widow in the 19th century. Her American travelogue itself is a fascinating document. It is often more a sociological report than a personal memoir, filled with statistical data on American government, commerce, and social conditions. She consciously sidelined her own experiences to present a model for India to emulate. She wrote, "The happiness I derived from seeing the marvelous things in the United States will remain incomplete unless I share it with my dear countrymen and women." When asked by a man in New York what the most deplorable thing she'd noticed in America was, she replied, "Friend, I have not come to your country to detect faults. I want only your good qualities. They are what I am looking for, and they are what I find." This uncritical admiration stands in sharp contrast to Swami Vivekananda's approach a few years later. While Vivekananda felt the West needed India's spiritual wisdom as much as India needed its material progress, Ramabai saw salvation for India primarily through an American model of development. In November 1888, her mission accomplished, Pandita Ramabai sailed from San Francisco back to India via Japan. She was returning as a Christian, a celebrity, a successful fundraiser, and a woman with a clear plan. She was at the height of her powers. Chapter 6. The Homecoming, Sharada Sadan and the Storm of Scandal. Ramabai returned to India in 1889 and immediately set to work. The promises made in America had to be kept. With the support of the Ramabai Association and even the Hindu reformers in Pune, who were momentarily placated by her secular aims and her fundraising success, she established the Sharada Sadan, Home of Learning, in Bombay. Its charter was explicitly secular. There would be no religious instruction. The goal was to provide high-caste child widows with a general education and vocational training, teaching, nursing, to make them self-reliant and empower them to live with dignity. It was a radical idea. For a few years, it worked beautifully. The number of residents grew. Young widows who would have otherwise been condemned to a life of servitude and neglect found a space for self-discovery and community. Ramabai was fulfilling her dream, but the inherent tension of her identity was a time bomb. She was a Christian running a secular home for Hindu widows. The Orthodox Brahmin community watched her with intense suspicion. The bomb exploded in the mid-1890s. It emerged that some of the girls at Sharada Sadan, inspired by Ramabai's own faith, had expressed a desire to convert to Christianity. Ramabai, a firm believer in individual choice, did not actively proselytize, but believed these women had the right to choose their faith. The reaction was hysterical. Newspapers like Tilak's Kesari led a vicious campaign, labeling Ramabai a deceitful demoness and accusing her of nationwide missionary designs. She was charged with luring widows into her net under the false pretense of social work. Families withdrew their girls. The Hindu reformers on the school's advisory board, including Renade, resigned in protest. An inquiry was instituted by the American Ramabai Association. Although the inquiry cleared her of direct proselytization, the damage was done. Sharada Sadan was socially ostracized. Ramabai had effectively lost the backing of mainstream Hindu society. The door to working within that society was slammed shut. This was the great turning point in her life. The rejection was total. Isolated and disillusioned with the hypocrisy of the liberal reformers, she made a decisive shift. If they would not allow her to help women on secular terms, she would do it on openly Christian ones. Chapter 7. Kedgaon and the Mukti Mission, a Kingdom of Women. Forced out of Pune, Ramabai moved her operation to Kedgaon, a village on the margins of the city. She acquired a 100-acre plot of land. This geographical marginalization mirrored her social marginalization. Here she would build her own world. The Mukti Mission, Mission of Salvation, was established. It was no longer just a school for high-caste widows. It was a comprehensive and ambitious sanctuary for any woman in need. The American Association raised over $90,000 for this new project. Mukti Mission expanded dramatically to address new crises. During the devastating famines of 1896-97, Ramabai traveled to the affected areas and rescued hundreds of girls from starvation and from the clutches of pimps who preyed on vulnerable, orphaned women. She brought them back to Mukti. The mission became a vast, self-sufficient complex. It was, as an admirer put it, a kingdom of women from top to bottom. It had schools and dormitories, a large industrial department where women learned weaving, tailoring, oil pressing, and farming. A printing press run entirely by women who typeset and printed Christian literature and school books. A dairy farm, gardens and orchards. Kripa Sadan, House of Mercy, a home for fallen women and the elderly. A church for worship. Caste and gender distinctions were ignored. Everyone worked, ate and prayed together. The mission was a practical implementation of Christian egalitarianism, but also of Ramabai's feminist vision of economic self-reliance and community. Her conflict with the colonial state also intensified during the plague epidemic. She was fiercely critical of the government's heavy-handed and gender-insensitive measures, such as forcibly entering homes to remove sick men and women. She documented cases of harassment by colonial officials and the abduction of young girls during the chaos, complaining that even her Anglican supporters in England did little to help. In this final phase, her religious focus also intensified. After the 10-year secular funding from the American Association ended, Mukti became explicitly Christian. Ramabai herself leaned into a more personal, gospel-based faith. She learned Greek and Hebrew to produce her own translation of the Bible into Marathi, a translation she deliberately purged of Sanskrit words to distance it from Brahmanical influence, creating a somewhat artificial but unique Marathi Christian lexicon. She had come full circle. The young girl who had memorized Sanskrit shlokas now dedicated her life to translating the Christian scripture. The woman who started in a forest ashram with her father ended her days in a larger, self-created ashram of her own, still on the margins. The final blow came in 1921, when her beloved daughter, Manorama, her constant companion for nearly 40 years, died prematurely. Ramabai, heartbroken, survived her by only a few months. She died on April 5, 1922, surrounded by the thousands of women who called her mother. Chapter 8. The Legacy, Erasure and Reclamation. So what is the legacy of this astonishingly complex woman? For decades, Pandita Ramabai was largely written out of the mainstream narrative of Indian social reform. In Maharashtra, she was, as scholar Meera Kosambi writes, still viewed with suspicion tinged with admiration and charged with having betrayed the national and social cause by her proselytism. Her conversion was an unforgivable sin in the eyes of nationalist history. But scholarship over the past few decades has begun to reclaim her, arguing that her erasure was rooted not just in her Christianity, but in her radical, uncompromising feminism that threatened both Hindu and Christian patriarchies. She was a woman who consistently defied categorization. She was a Hindu who became a Christian but rejected the church. She was a nationalist who worked with colonizers. She was a traditional scholar who became a modern reformer. She was an international icon who was marginalized in her own homeland. Her life forces us to confront the complex, often uncomfortable intersections of faith, gender, nationalism, and colonialism. She was not a simple heroine. She was a human being of profound contradictions, immense courage, and unwavering conviction. The Mukti mission still stands in Kedgaon today, a living testament to her vision. It continues to serve women and children in need, a silent but powerful echo of a woman who dared to break every rule to build a world of her own making. Pandita Ramabai's story is a testament to the power of an individual spirit, to resist, to quest, and to transform immense personal suffering into a legacy of compassion for thousands. She remains a challenging, provocative, and ultimately inspiring figure, a true rebel saint. Thank you for joining us on this journey through her life on the Indian Chronicle.